Well, the Game of Thrones has been won. At the end of the day, it was Bran the Broken who won it. Perhaps unexpectedly so, but if he had bothered to do anything at any point in the story, would actually be a sensible choice. But in our happiness, in our wanting to celebrate Bran's great victory, we have forgotten the most dangerous and villainous creature of them all, and that is bankers. Because you see, bankers are nefarious. Historically, they've been an absolute danger. Hence, people have forgotten one of the main threats to the Iron Throne, and that is the Iron Bank. For you see, there is a plot point that was established very early on that King's Landing is deeply in debt. Deeply, to the point where they owe 20 times more than what they own.
For years I've heard that Littlefinger is a magician. Whenever the crown needs money, he rubs his hands together and poof, mountains of gold.
He's stealing it?
Worse, he's borrowing it. It's the Iron Bank of Bravos. We owe them tens of millions. If we fail to repay these loans, the bank will fund our enemies. One way or another, they always get their gold back.
The Iron Bank, at the end of the day, is a supranational organization that affects the world finances. At the end of the day, they provide credits to organizations that do not have the financial means to continue. And as a consequence, they can dictate the tune of what they want to happen. If it's not to their liking, they'll simply dry up the credits and the organization in question will go bankrupt. In essence, they can use finance as a means of warfare. And this might seem bizarre, to use money as a source of violence, to use it to win political power. But it is a strategy that has been utilized for hundreds of years.
And you are now engaged in a conflict on several fronts. We both know how expensive war can be.
We both know gold wins wars. And the Iron Bank wants to bet on a winner.
We don't make bets. We invest in endeavors we deem likely to be
A
successful.
fancy way of saying bet.
If you look at a document that was leaked by WikiLeaks a few years ago, they actually outline using finance as a means of toppling governments, as a means of controlling political entities. In this document outlining unconventional warfare tactics, they say the following. If properly authorized and coordinated, the US Army can use or coordinate for other agencies to use measured and focused financial incentives and disincentives to persuade adversaries, allies, and surrogates to modify their behavior at the theater of strategic, operational, and tactical levels. Which in practice, this means that they're using their power, their money, to influence what you're gonna do. Say, for example, if you owe a bank a lot of debt and you depend on it to survive, then you're likely to follow what they say. If they say, well, sell your resources to this other entity, organize your structure in this way, you kind of have to do it. You kind of have to do it to survive at all. Now, here's the thing. This does sound nebulous, this sounds shady, and because to a certain extent it is, but the US is not alone in this. China, for example, is outright colonizing Africa through cheap loans because
Africa no longer bows to the US. Much of the continent is now economically and politically aligned with the world's fastest emerging superpower. China is playing a part in projects both big and small that are transforming African economies. Of course, China isn't just financing these projects out of kindness. For each of them, there's a political goal behind it.
they want to buy votes in the UN, they want to get African resources, and Africa is essentially becoming China's China.
China is getting a lot of influence for, in the grand scheme of things, not a lot of money. Of course, this data linking infrastructure investment with political leanings shows that there are indeed hidden strings that require benefit for China rather than benefit for the receiving country.
So it becomes a very nefarious way, a very cheap way, as it were, to control world politics. If Bran the Broken were to decide to completely ignore this, there are two options which are likely to occur. One, the crown would go bankrupt. And as a consequence, there would be civil unrest, there will likely be another civil war, and you don't want that. On the other hand, if they resist the influence of the Iron Bank can send more mercenaries that aren't in any way affected by the recent conflict and hence are fresh and completely wipe out the crown's forces. Hence, they're in a very precarious situation. If the Iron Bank starts dictating certain terms, they kind of have to listen. They kind of have to hear what this supranational organization is saying and follow the policies. If they start saying, well, we want this town just for our purposes, they kind of have to do it, or else. So it becomes a cheap way to control people because the interest on the loan just becomes eventually completely unpayable. So they have to continue sacrificing more and more of themselves until they're completely slaves in all but name. So whilst King's Landing might have initially won the battle, they have a very uphill financial situation. Not only that, but they have the absolute most incompetent person at the helm, and that is Bronn, who in seasons previous actually did not know how a loan worked.
I've never borrowed money before. I'm not clear on the rules.
Well, the basic principle is, I lend you money, and after an agreed upon period of time, you return it with interest.
And what if I don't?
Well, you have to.
But what if I don't?
Tyrion had to explain it to him, and that is the person who is in charge of financing the realm. That does seem eerily familiar with our day-to-day circumstances where absolutely incompetent people, through their political clout, get named as the governor of the bank, who get in charge of these vast resources, but at the end of the day, they don't quite know how to use them properly. So the Iron Bank, if anything, is patient. Like any such institution, it has to be opportunistic. It has to bide its time, but it won't write the debt off. Or else, if they were to write it off, they might end up in the situation of other historical banks. Say, for example, the famed Medicis. They actually went bankrupt when they funded Edward in the War of the Roses, which is the war that inspired Game of Thrones in the first place. With Edward at the helm, they thought that he was a sure thing, but the thing is, that's not what happened. At the end of the day, this relatively unknown line called the Tudors ended up winning what was back then the Game of Thrones. And the Tudors did not give two shits about the Medici's debt. They completely ignored it. And they'd already spent way too much on the whole endeavor. They couldn't fund another uppercomer to the throne because they simply did not have the financial resources. Hence they lost power. Hence they actually ended up just going bankrupt. So depending on the financial power that the bank wields, that the Iron Bank wields, we may not have heard the last of the Game of Thrones. If anything, the real battle might still be starting. But hey.
We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
That's just a thought. See you next week.